Okay, so I guess that's the start then. So good morning to all our participants and panelists in the US and Canada, and good afternoon to our participants, panelists and moderator in Berlin, Amman, Tunis, Khartoum, and everywhere else. Warm welcome from my side. My name is Elisabeth Braun. I'm heading the Middle East and Northern Africa Department of Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung. And yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome you here to today's online debate on the only constant is change, 10 years of Arab Spring between memories and continuation. And I understand that I should hand over directly for short technical remark to Saleh, and then I'll be right back.
Oh, thank you so much. So hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum. احنا هلا علشان اللي بده يسمع الترجمه راح يكون في شيء بالانجليزي وراح يكون في ترجمه طبعا بالالماني. فللحضور الكرام اذا بدكم تسمعوا الترجمه في تحت زي كره ارضيه. There is a globe on the bottom of the tool taskbar as you can see. If you click on it اذا بنكبس عليها في بيعطينا 3 options 3 اختيارات English, German, French. انجليزي، الماني، فرنسي. فاذا بدك تسمع بالفرنسي تكبس على الفرنسي، تسمع بالالماني من الالماني، واذا سوري الفرنسي هو العربي اسف اذا بدنا نسمع باللغه العربيه هو فرنسي، لانه شويه في Zoom doesn't still now support Arabic for all the latest versions. So اذا بدك تسمع باللغه العربيه click on French, for German click on German, for English click on English, and المترجمين والinterpreters they will be just flipping between the channels. المترجمين هم راح يكونوا بين السيشنز، وهيك بضلكم انتم سامعين كل الترجمه واللغه اللي بدكم اياها. شكرا جزيلا. Back to you.
Shukran jazilan. So yes, back to some introductory remarks, and as I said earlier on, it's good to have you here. We're hosting this online debate in cooperation with Zenith magazine, and we will also be streamed live into social media and have live translation into Arabic and German, as Salah just explained. So exactly 10 years ago, German-Egyptian political scientist Hamid Abdel Samad gave an interview to a German newspaper in which he said, "Since the Islamic world has never learned to be flexible, to rethink and to adapt, it is completely overwhelmed in the face of globalization, and therefore it will inevitably break down in the further course of globalization." As we have certainly seen in the last decade, he couldn't have been more wrong. Far from stagnant and passive, the societies of the Middle East and Northern Africa have showcased that they are as vibrant and as longing for freedom as other civil societies across the world. They have also shown that they are resilient and that the demands for freedom, social justice, and dignity are not easily repressed. Almost 10 years have passed now since a series of popular uprisings reshaped the countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa in what is often referred to as the Arab Spring. And this wave of uprising, as the last 2 years have shown, is far from over. Since 2019, a new wave of protests has begun to shake the MENA-region, including Lebanon, Sudan, and Iraq. And these protests are often driven by very similar conditions than the 2011 uprisings. The Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, FES, has accompanied these processes throughout the last decade, often in close partnership with the agent of change. And on a personal note, if you allow, as our director of the FES Tunis office from 2011 to 2014, I actually had the privilege to get some close insights on some of the ups and downs in the making. So we did, for example, so in Tunisia back in 2011, where one of our longtime partners, the UGTT, continues to play a crucial role in advocating social interest, even in facing new crises, such as the corona pandemic. And we are doing so with new partners, such as, for example, in Sudan, where we assist those professional syndicates with organizing who were at the forefront of the protests against the regime of Omar al-Bashir. Reason enough for us to look back and take stock and to ask ourselves which parallels can actually be drawn between the demonstrations then and now. Are there commonalities, and what are the differences? What actors are involved, and are they the same actors as in 2011? And how are the Arab Spring and its results perceived 10 years later? What happened to the main demands of the Arab Spring? These questions, some of which will be at the center of this online debate, were also guiding questions for a joint publication that we recently published together with Zenith. The special issue is titled Das Arabische Jahrzehnt, the Arab Decade, and you can see the wonderful cover, hopefully on your screen directly. It touches upon the memories and consequences of the protests from 2011 to 2019. The German dossier is open access and can be accessed through the link that will be posted in the chat. Arabic and English versions will be published regularly on our MENA blog, and you should hopefully also see the link in the chat. So this special issue includes countless unique voices and artists from the region, including, for example, the Egyptian journalist Lina Attallah from Madamasar, who was recently included in the Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people in the world. And, for example, the renowned street artist Aya Tarek, who helped shape the imagery of the Arab Spring with her unique artwork and who created a set of special graphics to illustrate our publication. So these are just some of the highlights. And I understand that Robert will actually point out a few more in the following. So yes, some of them are directly with us here today, and you will hear about them in the debate. And without further ado, I will hand over to Robert Chatterjee, one of the editors-in-chief of Zenith magazine. And in this context, I would like to wholeheartedly thank Zenith again for the fruitful cooperation, and hand over to you, Robert, for the moderation and introduction of the speakers directly. Thank you for this cooperation. Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to all of you for joining this debate.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you to all your colleagues at Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. This is, by the way, the print version of the magazine that we just shown a few glimpses into it. I would like to welcome everyone who has tuned in from all over the world. And I want to especially welcome our panelists, all of whom have contributed to this dossier on 10 years of Arab Spring, or let's say the first 10 years maybe of the Arab Spring. I will introduce each of them with my first question, just a few introductory remarks. You can post your questions in the Q&A section. We will collect the questions and then we'll later direct them to the panelists. Just a very short notice. One of our panelists, Ms. Lara Baladi, she can't stay for the whole duration of this event. So I would like to encourage you to pose your questions to her maybe first, so we can maximize her presence in this event. Lara, I also want to directly start with you. As we are sitting here with the approaching anniversary of the beginning of the Arab Spring, many think, how does this event fare like in the grand scheme of things? And this is exactly what you do. This is what you are teaching and what you are accumulating material for. You are the founder, you're an artist, of course, and you are the founder of the Tahrir archives. Just give us a glimpse. What made you think that we need this kind of archive, and what is the main purpose of that, and what has this archive derived in its first decade of its existence?
Here. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm very happy to participate in this very important and timely debate. So to answer briefly your question, the Tahrir Archives is the kind of umbrella title for a project that's been going on since 2011. And so as an artist, I shifted my work based in Cairo in everything that was related to Tahrir and that came out of Tahrir. But then I expanded it to different revolutions and protests across the world, not just in the Arab region, but also in in the US and other parts of the world. And more recently, with the 2019 wave of protest, I've also been looking into the kind of iconography that's come out of these moments. And of course, in the US, the anti-racist movements, which are very recent and timely also. So this work is today, so for the last 10 years almost, I've been producing artworks that have used my archive, and that I call it perform the archive. So I've been using this archive as a way of digging language and different parts of the moments in different revolution, breaking down the kind of phases through which protests go and revolutions are understood throughout history. And to answer the last part of your question, the upcoming year is of course a very important one, as it will celebrate the 10th anniversary not only of the Arab Spring, but Occupy movements and a whole decade of protest. And so my project is now more looking at history and digging again into the Tahrir archives to put together an abecedary, an ABC of revolting, using iconography and references that will sort of give an overview of how history is represented, but also a kind of guidebook or a way to kind of tap into a moment such as the one we've experienced 10 years ago.
The word Tahrir usually designates a lot of places and prominent cities in the Middle East. It has also become synonymous with the Tahrir Square in Cairo, gave the name to the Tahrir archives, and also to the institute that our next panelist works for, the Tahrir Center for Middle East Policy. So I would really warmly welcome Roba Ali Al-Hassani, who is a sociologist who specializes in the sociology of religion and social justice and social control. Roba, you're also here as like a representative of the second wave, that not the bad second wave of the coronavirus, but like the revolutionary wave that we kind of coined that way, that started last year in Iraq. So do you feel that, how do you feel like Iraq is connected to this first wave? I know there were protests also in 2011, but what is different now about this phase, and how does it connect to this decade that we are now taking a look at large?
Hi, thanks for having me here. So just a reflection on the word tahrir, because it's an Arabic word. It's common in many parts of the Middle East. And Baghdad also has its own Tahrir Square, where there's a unique monument by the late Iraqi sculptor Jawad Salim. And so it's very unique. If you just look up Tahrir Square Baghdad, you'll see it. And speaking of iconography, it has the image, the sculpted images of men breaking out from the shackles of prison and into freedom. And so it's like a series of images. As for the second wave, I would say Iraq has had protests over the past 15 years. The only difference is that the protests, now are much larger, they're much more unified, and this is the culmination of over a decade of mobilization. So in 2011, protests in Iraq were probably not as dramatic as the ones in Egypt. It did not overthrow a government, but there were other protests going on. And the thing is about Iraq, every time there are protests, they take place in the summer, which is when there's a really, intense heat wave. And so these protests are always associated with a lack of proper electricity, which is when people, use it for cooling purposes. But people seem to miss the point that the protests were never just about electricity and basic services. They were about corruption. They were about the establishment that has not been working towards the interests of the Iraqi people. And this has, intensified over the past few years with a number of developments, especially since 2014 with the ISIS incursion and the ongoing realization that the governments since 2003 have been failing the Iraqi people on catastrophic levels. And so in 2019, the October Revolution, or Thawra Tishrin, was launched, and it may have slowed down due to COVID, but it is continuing and ongoing and beginning to take new forms.
Thank you, Ruba. I would now like to ask the representative of another country, so to say, of the second wave. Khulud, we have talked a few months back in another Zoom call about the ongoing developments in Sudan. We made a whole Zoom event about that. Since then, again, lots has happened in Sudan. There is an ongoing transition, and it's so how would you describe it? Is that a very unique Sudanese path that the country is taking? Is this something that could be an example? And what is your impression of the way this transition in Sudan is going?
Hi everyone, I was on mute, sorry. Nice to be here. Thank you, Robert. It's a broad question, so I think I'll just kind of narrow it down a little bit. I mean, the transition, it's funny that we're talking about the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and this seems all very, very cyclical. And in the Sudanese example, it seems even more cyclical, right? Because this is our third revolution that we had in 2018, 2019, and this is the third transition that we're in at the moment. And so this all feels like, this kind of continuity and change is very much alive, I think, within what's going on in the Sudanese transition at the moment. And, there's a chance to learn here from what has gone before, to kind of learn the mistakes of what has gone before. Protest movements before and uprisings before used to be much more exclusive. They used to be very kind of male-centered and very Khartoum-centric centered. And there are initiatives now to try and get away from that, to get past that. But even within the kind of the broader Arab region context, and and here we also have to remember that Khartoum kind of, or Sudan and Khartoum and all the regions of Sudan, because it's kind of a subcontinent really, then it's as a country, it doesn't really fall very easily within either an Arab or an African context. And so we have to we see, the impact of that in that it mirrors what goes on in the Arab world very much, but also what goes in sub-Saharan Africa. And in sub-Saharan Africa, there was actually the Arab Spring for at least 10 years. And so I think what's going on in Sudan at the moment is a product of its own history, but also what's going on in its kind of multi-regional geography that Sudan is situated in. But one of the things that we do have this time that we didn't have in the previous uprisings and revolutions of 1964 and 1985, and also that maybe perhaps isn't as evident in other contexts within Africa or the Arab world, is this idea of resistance committees, which are neighborhood level committees of protesters that keep up the momentum of this kind of resistance, that they keep up the strength of this coalition. And they're the ones who are kind of caretakers of this transition, while we have, even while we have a sort of a civilian government that's part of this larger, broader, hybrid military civilian government. And so I think people understand that we're battling history here. We're also battling, the second wave of Arab uprisings. What we've seen isn't large scale change at the top with dictators falling one by one, like before in 2011. We're seeing piecemeal changes of prime ministers, perhaps, the withdrawal of a tax bill that was causing problems. We're seeing the governments being able to respond to these protests a lot a lot kind of more effectively. And so one of the good things about having the resistance committees is they work at the grassroots level, and they work very well at keeping up that pressure and keeping up that momentum, because we're seeing this sort of, Bashir fell, but we still have a military presence at the moment in Sudan. So it's not a complete victory in the way that people had envisaged, in the way that it happened in previously in Sudan's history. So lots of continuities and change right there, and we can pick those up later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Khulud. Speaking of continuities and change and having a long breath, a lot of patience with how things play out, this leads me to Henrik Meyer, who is situated in Tunis. He heads the office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation there. And just as Sudan, for some people from the outside looking, came as a surprising location for change, the same thing was the case with Tunisia, which took a lot of people by surprise that the things were starting there. Now, Henrik, in a few weeks, almost just 5 weeks, we have the official 10-year anniversary. How's the mood in Tunis? Do you feel any kind of anticipation, or do the challenges of the present overshadow this reflection on the past?
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thank you to Zenith for the excellent cooperation on this whole issue. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, or as you already indicated, it's a bit hard to say how Tunisians feel about the anniversary of the revolution these days, because they are kind of overwhelmed with worries that are much more concrete and much closer to the living realities, I would say, because as the entire world, obviously Tunisia is very much affected by the COVID pandemic. And Tunisia managed the first wave extraordinarily well. You know, we had a few months here without a single domestically transmitted case. But now Tunisia is hit very hard by the second wave. Hospitals are already overcrowded and so on. And everybody in Tunisia knows somebody who has been affected by this disease and so on. So, and of course, also the economic breakdown is very much a reality in Tunisia. So these days, people are very much focused on their daily worries, let's say, and not really about 10 years of revolution, change, Arab Spring, whatever you want to call it. So, I mean, if I want to answer your question, I believe this needs something like a thought experiment. So we would need to think that how would the mood be if there was no pandemic? I mean, how would people feel in a normal year, in a year without a pandemic, when there's more or less business as usual? How would people feel about the anniversary of the revolution? And how would the country prepare? And to be honest, I believe the answer to this question would be quite sobering. I mean, there would be, of course, official events. International organizations would have organized expositions and panel discussions. Human rights organizations would have emphasized the importance of free speech. Parliament would have celebrated its very existence and so on. But to be honest, for the population of Tunisia at large, it would not have been a day of pure enthusiasm and joy, let's say, because taking stock of 10 years of revolution and democracy can only lead to a very ambiguous kind of appreciation, let's say, because we face in Tunisia, I guess we can say that now almost 10 years after the start of this revolution, a problem that I would call outcome legitimacy. I mean, the Tunisian democracy has not been able, quite obviously, to live up to the expectations of the population, the expectations that were formulated during the revolution. But in addition to that, we also face a crisis of something like a procedural legitimacy, which means that people are also kind of fed up with watching political parties getting tangled up in useless fights amongst each other, and watching the very difficult decision-making process in parliament and so on. So I would say there's at least a twofold crisis of Tunisian democracy that makes it really difficult to consider 10 years of revolution purely a success. And the frustration is actually really, really strong in Tunisia. I mean, things could have been different. I mean, for example, end of last year, we had elections, and these elections were fair and free and everything you wish for. And at the beginning of the year, we also had a government that was kind of a political government that also took it up on itself to engage in real reforms and so on. So had there been no pandemic and had this government not been overthrown in the meantime, actually, maybe we would have been a bit more optimistic today. But really, if you ask me how the mood of the people is, I don't believe that you would find many people who would say we have had a decade of success or so on. This is really not the mood of Tunisians. And today, people, I believe, are really not nostalgically looking back to the times of the dictatorship, but they are not enthusiastic about the parliamentary democracy either. They look for something else. I don't believe people are not politicized anymore, to the contrary, but I think they are looking for something else. And maybe this is something that we can elaborate on a bit more during this discussion. The general feeling in Tunisia is a feeling of being disenchanted, and there's a clear sense of, let's say, not democracy fatigue, but maybe representative democracy fatigue, something like that. This does not mean that they want to go back, as I said, but it means that there's a general sense of paralysis that very much curbs political activism, and the COVID crisis has exacerbated this even more.
Coming back to you, Lara, a lot of the points that were raised, also just raised by Henrik, are certainly points that you would also find in the country that you are based in. And you are taking kind of a bird's eye view and also looking for parallels and patterns across the Arab region. So if we just for a moment also widen our gaze, especially maybe also on the eve of the US election that's upon us tomorrow, and especially this year that saw a massive new public protest movement in the US. How would you connect those movements, maybe also others, with what we have been witnessing in the wider Middle East?
Okay, here I'm unmuted. Yes, so yes, the work I'm doing, and again, I'm not a historian. I'm doing this from the perspective of an artist. So it's sometimes informal, but also anarchist in a sense, as I don't follow necessarily a methodology that an academic would follow. But I'm interested in the visual representation of these moments and these uprisings. And I've been doing this research since Tahrir Square in Egypt. And it was very interesting to, for me, what happened is that when the moment started, when the 25th of January started in Egypt, I immediately remembered that was one of the first viral videos that was published on the internet was a video of a tank, of a police tank, water tank, and a protester confronting this tank. And the title of the YouTube video was Tiananmen, Cairo, Courage Like. And immediately I remembered as a child 1989 and Tiananmen Square and the tank man. And so that sort of kick-started my my archiving process and sort of comparing, but also creating parallels between different places and different moments in time. And that's been work I've been doing now for 10 years. And interestingly, one of the first things I did when Tahrir Square started was to Google revolution and find a Wikipedia page that starts as far as Ramses III in Egypt, when the first written manuscript that is found to exist in the world that describes a strike of workers is actually located in Egypt in those days. So protesting is protesting or revolutions are cycles, are part of the cycle of history, and they kind of they more or less happen in similar ways, in similar cyclical, with anchor, sort of important anchoring moments within the cycle of revolting in different places in the world, but also in different cultures and different times in the world. And of course, what we've seen also in the last year, in 2019, whether it's in Sudan or in Lebanon, of course, is just other examples of how there's a moment of uprising, there's a second wave of trying to negotiate new ground, and then there's a kind of return to an old regime and a resistance to change. And this is more on the political side of things. But I think I would like to highlight before I leave the conversation, before everybody else, I would like to highlight the importance of an ongoing wave within that cycle of parallels that we can see between different cultures. And this ongoing wave is the fact that when these moments happen, there's a raising, there's a rise in consciousness, a rise in awareness in the political importance of participating socially, and not only politically, really socially. And what we really see today in Egypt, and I will talk for what I know, and maybe also Lebanon, is definitely the fact that, in a sense, this movement hasn't finished, and it hasn't stopped, and it's going on, but just in a different way than one would think about revolution. So I would look at it more from the social perspective and look at how people today are very different and behave very different with each other, but also with the environment, with like you just said, Henrik, also the outlook on the possibilities of, you know, how to create a better tomorrow are a very different approach. I mean, there will not be another Tahrir Square. There will not be another Arab uprisings or Arab Spring, which I don't really like as a term, but there will be change, and change is, as in your title, that's the only constant that we know. And it's still happening, and it's still, and what's beautiful is to see that that wave has just perpetuated itself since Ramses III, but especially in the last decade. I think what we saw in the rest of the region, the Arab region, but also across now in the US and everywhere else, is always referring to Tahrir Square as a kind of archetype of a moment where people realize they have to create change, and that change comes from changing also individually before changing socially and politically. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I mean, in the shorts of time, yeah, definitely food for thought. And I would like to dive into that social justice maybe with Ruba, because you are studying this concept of social justice, but on the other side also social control. Now, social justice is something not only in Iraq, but even in Iraq, if you would ask anyone, even from militias, they would all say, yeah, of course we are for social justice. So it's such a term that nobody could possibly have something against with, that a lot of people claim for themselves. How is the battle for this narrative unfolding, for example, in Iraq, and who's getting the upper hand there?
Well, the term does have its own subjectivity, unfortunately, and it depends on each person's truth, each pocket of the population's truth. So we can talk about, you know, majority Arab Iraqis, and then we can talk about Yazidis and Turkoman and Assyrians, who have all been subjected to ISIS genocide. Their truth is very different from that of the majority of the population. Iraq is very pluralistic by nature, by indigeneity. And so the idea of truth is very personal, it's very subjective, and social justice emanates from that. The idea that everyone is seen as equal will not necessarily be the same from every perspective. So when I did share an article about Black Iraqis, you know, who have seen the, you know, anti-racist movements in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, and they have spoken up recently and said, well, we struggle from racial injustice here in Iraq. And I remember a couple of Arab Iraqis saying, no, we don't have racism here in Iraq, you know, there's no such thing. And my first question for them was, are you Black? Can you speak for that experience? do you have that lived experience to say we don't have it in Iraq? And Iraq has a sizable Black population, especially in the south in Basra. So social justice does have its subjectivities. One person's lived experience is not that of another. And militias, on the other hand, they claim to speak, they speak of resistance. They call themselves al-muqawama, the resistance, and that they are resisting imperialism, and which is, objectively, a just cause. Everyone wants to, I shouldn't say everyone, but anti-imperialism is an important cause that continues to this day. But militias use that narrative to justify their presence, to justify their carrying of illegitimate arms. They use that to justify their anti-Americanism on Iraqi soil. And they will talk about foreign meddling, US foreign presence, and other foreign presence from European countries in Iraq. But ironically, they will not address their lack of awareness about Iranian presence in Iraq through them, by proxy of them. So they will talk about, NATO, they will talk about the US presence in particular. It is like the grand evil of all, but they will not ironically talk about Iranian foreign presence and, meddling in Iraq through their presence, who's funding them, who's empowering them, who's providing them with a support network to continue their work in Iraq. The other day, they released a statement inviting people who work with US forces, such as translators, to switch to their side. And they have offered generous incomes, salaries for those who will switch sides and work for them against the US. And my first thought was, the Arabic phrase "min ayna lakum hada," which means, where do you have this? Where does all this money come from? If you can afford to pay one person $50,000 and another, over $50,000, who's funding you? So the idea of social justice, it has a broad scope, but the Iraq protest movement has taken that to another level. And the protest movement is not only anti-establishment, but it's countering a lot of social injustice, such as gendered injustice. And the Iraqi protest movement has pushed women to the forefront, and this is a young generation that is very different from the generation that's leading the country. And so they have a different mindset. They're millennials and younger than millennials. And so their perspective of everything is so different. And you see a clash, a generational clash between them and their critics. And this protest movement has pushed women to the forefront, who are women leading chants, leading marches. And I won't forget this video clip from last March. It was International Women's Day. And it was young men partying in the streets and, protesting and chanting and calling on women to come down and lead them in protest. And I may sound, biased, but I think it is true that if it was older men, they would not have engaged in such a chant. They would not have called on women to lead them in protest. So social justice takes on different forms, and there's social control, in the media now. Since the protests began, there is an online campaign to demonize the protesters, to demonize the female protesters in particular, to taint their reputation, to discredit the protest movement. And those online campaigns claim to point out the evil in the protests and how the protesters are not really seeking social justice. They just want to be chaotic. They just want to cause chaos. And this is where the term Jokeria comes from. The movie last year with Joaquin Phoenix, The Joker, came out last year. And it took on a very interesting note in Iraq. The word Joker has been used to as a derogatory term to label protesters as people who just want to wreak havoc and who just want to create destruction. And so the online campaigns by militia affiliates call protesters Zokaria, as people who don't want social justice, who just want to create chaos. So there is a clash of narratives, certainly, as would be the case with any protest movement. And it will be interesting to see how things play out. But the protest movement in particular has gained a lot of traction amongst different classes in society, across different sectors, labor unions, academic associations, the Bar Association. A lot have joined the protests, which demonstrates that, the definition of social justice coming from the protests is broad in scope, and it will address a number of social justice issues and a number of narratives that people from different pockets of society would share.
Thank you, Roba. Your point about the gender injustice is good transition to Khulud. Khulud, you if you saw our cover, I'm very sure you saw what we were alluding to here, a very iconic image that maybe one of the iconic images of the Arab Spring in general. Now, you've been talking in the interview in the magazine a lot about the contribution of women, and also about the changing nature of gender relations in Sudan. So if you could just follow up on what Roba was just saying, and also maybe tell us a bit what has actually been happening, because a lot of these points have been discussed in terms of changes in actual law. So could you take us on that from both the societal role, but also and how legal status questions have been discussed and changing?
I think when we spoke, which was a few months ago, some legal reforms had come in June, and in particular they had targeted the public order laws, which had been brought in specifically under the Islamist project to control society through the control of women, in particular women's bodies. And this applied, of course, as usual, to more vulnerable women, so poorer women, displaced women, women from the margins, etc., but also activists within civil society. And I think Ruba makes a good point, is that, when you speak about a broad coalition for social justice, whose version or whose vision of social justice do you mean? And during the revolution, we saw a much more coalesced, a much more clearer picture about what that social justice looks like. And I think now that we've entered a transition, that's become less clear, because during the revolution was a case of whatever the Islamists had and Bashir's government had kind of come up with was very much clearly against social justice. But people's idea of just the intricacies around what that meant and the practicalities around what that meant are still being contested today. And so, when we spoke in June and those laws had come in and those reforms had come in, one of the things that was very clear was that they hadn't gone far enough, because they had still existed within a Sharia law framework. And that Sharia law framework was very much a politicized legal framework made by the Islamists for a specific political objective. And so kind of deconstructing that and doing away with that in a way that still that isn't very disruptive socially is a very difficult balance to strike. But I know that the government currently and the Ministry of Justice is working very hard to try and find a way to get rid of, in particular, the personal status laws, which govern inheritance, custody, divorce, and marriage. And then these are the kind of laws that really do oppress women the most. Some women can take 5 years for them to finally get a divorce, and often in contravention, actually, ironically, of Islamic jurisprudence. And at the same time, being able to travel with their children without the permission of their husbands is difficult. Sometimes it's impossible. There are very, heartbreaking stories about children who have died because for whatever reason, the men hadn't given permission for that child to travel abroad for treatment, etc. And of course, these things all sit within a context of political and economic degradation. And so what you get is this kind of idea of prioritization. So often, I think, I certainly hear that people say, you know, we understand that women are oppressed, but perhaps this isn't a problem for now because, you know, there is a shortage of fuel and there's a shortage of wheat and people can't eat. But I think what people fail to understand, and of course this is also a product of the last 30 years, is that every part of life is gendered, and therefore people's experiences of those national issues like the wheat and fuel shortages are also undergo a gender lens and are therefore also experienced differently by not just women, but different types of women. So depending on class and ethnicity and geography. And so it's quite an intersectional thing, but I don't think that we have as yet cultivated the language to be able to properly address systemic oppression. And that's, you know, in part because of the past 30 years, and though Sudan has a very vibrant civil society and that is very active and in some cases very broad, because of the way that the Bashir government had kind of specifically cracked down on organizing and on women organizing, you know, a lot of the conversations that were being had, a lot of the issues that were being discussed at the time were kind of very much larger, very kind of obviously oppressive issues, rather than these maybe developing a methodology or a framework within which to discuss how some of the lingering problems in a transition context still also impact you know, women and girls and different types of women and girls in particular, but you know, and also men. And I think we don't have yet that. We're not at the level yet where we can discuss how, you know, the patriarchy affects men, and how that continues actually, how women's oppression takes shape. So there's definitely a lot to be done. I think it's very encouraging that the legal reforms are taking shape and that they didn't just stop in June. You know, when, you know, a lot of kind of key issues like there was the taking away the death penalty for same-sex relations, for example, which was this kind of landmark shift. Also in terms of women's rights, in terms of what you can wear and you know, whether the National Intelligence Security Service, NIS, would be able to get involved and ask you what you're wearing and who you're with and what you're doing. You know, that kind of those kind of landmark issues was significant, but I'm glad that we didn't stop where we were then. And the civil society has been able to kind of very quickly push against, or rather push for and lobby for greater levels of change.
Thank you, Khulud. I would like to come back to Lara because unfortunately she has to leave us right away in a few minutes. So just very shortly, I would like still to squeeze in one last question for Lara, one that also came from the audience. This is about social media and maybe also the way that these personalized truth that Ruba also talked about form. So in the long run, I mean, in the beginning, we talked, a lot of attention was paid to Facebook and how that started organizing. Now in the long run, 10 years after, what is your take? How did the perception of that changed, and how will this shape also maybe the next decade?
I'm sorry I have to go so promptly because the conversation is so fascinating, and thank you everybody for the input and the things I'm learning every day about this context. Social media is a big subject within the Arab Spring and of course in the world. And I think what happened very briefly, and apology for this, the influence or the role of social media in the Arab Spring was very much articulated at the very early days of 2011, when especially in Egypt with the Facebook page of Khalid Said, we are all Khalid Said, And of course, there was a lot of controversy around also the fact that it was not a Facebook revolution or it was a Facebook revolution and so on. But really what we've really been observing is that this was also not something new, that in 2009 in Iran, Twitter had a very important role in the protest, and that social media network was probably more active at the time. In Egypt, the role of Facebook became an important one. It was definitely not the only one. It was definitely not the center and why the revolution took place, the uprisings, but it definitely played a very important, influential role. And at the time, there was other social networks. Twitter, of course, was an important one too for that whole period. But today, what we see is it's like everything. It has a double cutting side, like a knife, in a sense that you have one possibility to use the tool against the people or with the people. And so today, first of all, Facebook is much more controlled, but also the shift of the new generation has gone to Snapchat or to Instagram or to other types of networks. So these networks are evolving as we go, and they're much more absorbed as being part of the language and of society, but they're also by default, they're also much more controlled and therefore much more dangerous in a sense for people who are outspoken. And so we've seen this happen a lot in the last couple of years, where there's a kind of reinforcement of cutting down on voices that express themselves through social media. And so the role of social media is, of course, a good one, but also a bad one in a sense. So this too is an interesting thing to look at in the next couple of years, and to see how that is going to affect the next waves of protest, because as we are going and the difficulties that we are facing globally, I don't see how that will not happen again. And of course, historically, this is how the cycle of history goes. So there is going to be responses to these new difficulties, but probably these responses will be supported in very different way with different types of technologies. And also, just to give a little bit of insight into the work I'm doing, I did start my archive based on the language that came out of Facebook and Twitter, and the exchange that was happening, the conversation that was happening over social networks at the moment of the uprising, and the interesting kind of analogies that people were making as they were looking at things from the Tunisian perspective, the Egyptian perspective, and later from the Syrian perspective and other perspectives. So as far as I'm concerned, the language that emerged from social media is very much at the core of the work I'm doing in analyzing these waves of revolutions and uprisings. And I will leave you here, and I thank you very much, everybody.
We thank you, Lara. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Take care, stay safe. One general remark on if you want to post your questions, you can also post them in the chat window. And since I just skipped Henrik, he will get now 2 questions, and I hope you will answer them shortly and succinctly. One pertains to an unlikely social media star in Tunisia who became the new president of Tunisia, and a kind of a new model, new old model of politician, a kind of populism that also reminds us a lot of populism in the West. Can you elaborate a bit on that kind of populism that we've seen now in Tunisia, and how it has been changing the media landscape? Second question, this is more general. This actually came in Arabic, and this is the hard one, so I give you a bit more time to think about it. What if Mohamed Bouazizi had not burned himself in Tunisia? what would have happened? Maybe also for the other ones to contemplate, but Henrik, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, thank you. I saw that question in the chat. I already took a few notes. Where to start? First of all, very interesting inputs by all of the panelists. I can very much relate to what Ruba has said about the more holistic point of what social justice means or political change maybe means and so on. And because I believe what we have seen in Tunisia is that, I mean, for many years, we have always discussed this question, is Tunisia like a role model for other nations or not? Are other countries going to follow the Tunisian path? And I think this debate is a bit outdated, but what is kind of clear is that Tunisia has taken a different path than all of the other countries in the region, and that has had some impact. And one of them is the new elected president, Kais Saied, that you alluded to, Robert, and I will say a few words about him. And maybe because I don't want to sound too pessimistic about what I'm describing, I just want to emphasize that there have been great successes here in Tunisia as well. For example, as an FES representative, I can tell you that we organize a lot of regional activities here. And whenever we have debates here with people from all over the region, people are always really impressed by the extent of freedom and liberty in Tunisia, the freedom of debate and the freedom of speech. This is really something that is very unique and that is a great achievement. I don't want to underestimate this. This is something that is really an achievement. But of course, on the other hand, many things have not changed, other things that have been demanded during the revolution. And that is why we have seen now, I would say, something like a second revolution that has happened through elections and not in the streets. And maybe I can say a few words about this. Because, I mean, first, what I believe is really important to say about Tunisia, because it's also important for other countries, is that installing a parliament or a parliamentary democracy is not the solution, the silver bullet to all problems, obviously. I mean, that is really obvious. I want to believe that it is a precondition for resolving problems if you have a democratic regime. But Tunisia is an example that shows that parliamentary revolution or the parliamentary democracy is not necessarily a starting point for further change. It can also be like a final point and then a stalemate point or so that can then actually procrastinate very important reforms that do not follow suit. But maybe a few words about populism. We have had the phenomenon in Tunisia that political parties are extremely unpopular in Tunisia. If you take a look at opinion polls and so on, nobody in Tunisia trusts political parties. And I mean, there are reasons for that. If you follow how political parties have behaved in the post-revolutionary Tunisia, the performance was really not good. Parties are born, they grow, then they get tangled up in inner party fights, they split into several parties. They reunite, they lose members of parliament, they gain others, and they lose them again, and so on. And ultimately, they implode. I mean, in the elections of last year, we have had 4 major parties that simply disappeared during the elections because people were not content with what these parties were doing. And so far, I must say, unfortunately, 2020 has not been better than the years before. We also see the same kind of problems that we have seen before. But what has changed was that in 2019, we have elected, or Tunisia has elected a new president, Kais Saied, who is really different from all other politicians that I believe I know of in the Arab world, I would say. He's a lawyer or a constitutionalist, let's say. He's 65 years old, and he doesn't have a party. He doesn't have like support from traditional media or so, but he has very large popular support, and he has a very successful Facebook campaign that led him to where he is. And he is very often considered to be a populist. But before I elaborate on that, I just want to say that populism is not populism in the same sense that it is everywhere in the world. I mean, there are different kinds of populism in, let's say, the US, in Europe, in Brazil, India, or in Tunisia. I mean, to start with everything that people say about the new Tunisian president, Kais Saied, no one would say that he built his campaign on xenophobia or hatred. That's not the kind of populism that he stands for. It's more in the sense that I give to the people what the people are longing for. And in the Tunisian context, that means getting rid of political parties that are perceived as self-centered and out of touch with the problems of the general population. They are They want to hold decision makers accountable to very severe standards of anti-corruption and not advancing any further than necessary with individual freedoms, but orient more towards a majority-based understanding of society and morals. Today, Kais Saied is by far the most popular politician in Tunisia, and he has extremely far-reaching ideas of how to transform the political system. He wants persons and not parties to be elected. He wants it to be the direct representatives of the people. He wants to establish a permanent system of accountability, not a periodical one such as elections. And he wants the system to be headed by a president and not a prime minister. These are very radical views that would eventually abolish the system of representative democracy as we know it. And it is actually a system that resembles very much the Libyan Jamahiriya under Gaddafi. And personally, I'm skeptical if this could work at all, because I believe such a system is of a direct democracy is very much prone to populism and personality cult, let's say. But from an analytical point of view, it is nevertheless very interesting because it shows to what extent within only 10 years, the system of representative democracy has delegitimized itself. And that is what I meant by saying that it's also important for other countries to see what happened in Tunisia, because just installing like a parliamentary democracy is not a silver bullet to resolve all the problems. I mean, in Tunisia, it's really obvious that party democracy is in a deep crisis. And by the way, this is not only the case for Tunisia, but for the time being, we do not really see a good alternative other than going back to the authoritarian type of government. And if we want to avoid that, I believe that it's in all our interest to make, let's say, political actors, to help them to better do their job and understand what their job is. But this is like Tunisia in this sense is very specific, but I believe it's interesting to see for other countries what has happened in only 10 years, because 10 years ago we started with high hopes for parliamentary democracy, and today the general mood is not so optimistic anymore. Would there have been a revolution without Bouazizi? Well, I don't know if there would have been a revolution, but I mean, there have been systemic contradictions in the way Tunisia was operating, let's say the Tunisian society, Tunisian political economy, the Tunisian economy and these things. And I believe that this sooner or later would have erupted in one way or another, and I think that is why, I mean, all what we have seen in the region stems from systemic contradictions and systemic problems, and not from, let's say, individual action and so on. I mean, there's something much deeper behind all that. So maybe without Bouazizi, we would not have seen this kind of revolution in 2009, 2010. But I'm deeply convinced that the system as it was would not have withheld for much longer. But of course, nobody can know. But I mean, this would also be a question for the other panelists, of course, how they see this from their perspectives. But I believe something would have happened sooner or later.
Yeah, definitely. The question is also for the other panelists. This is also, I think we agree that structural reasons were behind that. But if we look at the dynamic that took place in 2010, 2011 with Tunisia and then Egypt, what do you think? What if there's? I mean, this is very speculative, but if could have been been another turn of events with the same underlying factors at play? What do you think? It's an open question. It's no right or wrong answer. So maybe Ruba, you want to go first?
So can you rephrase the question? It's about what triggered these movements in each context?
Yeah, so the question, this came from the audience, was if the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia didn't happen and set off this kind of chain of events, would we have still seen this transnational Arab movement that came about, or would have it transpired somewhat differently? And if yes, how? What do you think?
I hate to say this because it sounds so sad and grim, but in Iraq, I think people are sort of unfazed by violence, by self-inflicted violence. the suicide rate in Iraq has increased over the past year. And it comes as no surprise because the Iraqi population in particular has gone through such trauma since the days of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime. And it has been ongoing with consistent terrorism since 2003, whether under the hands of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the government or militias. So violence has become a part of daily life, but even self-inflicted violence, people, I'm happy to say, and happy is a subjective term, to say that people are still impacted, when they see news of a case of murder or a case of suicide, that human connection is still there. So despite being unfazed by violence in general, there's still that human connection, that empathy. I'm not sure if a singular case of suicide in Iraq would trigger the movement. I think what triggered the movement in Iraq in particular are systemic issues. So there has been, collective emotion. Revolutions at their very essence are a boiling point of emotion. And it doesn't mean that they're irrational. If anything, it means they're, immediate and long-term impacts of systemic oppression, of systemic problems. And so in Iraq, the protests began and they continue to express the joy of collective mobilization. But at the same time, they have been subjected to so much violence and a brutal crackdown by the government and by militias. And over 700 people have been murdered. Activists continue to be targeted and assassinated on a daily basis. As we speak now, police forces in Basra are practicing brutality against peaceful protesters. So I'm not sure if a particular singular act of self-immolation or self-harm would trigger the movement in Iraq like it did in others. Maybe if it was someone, I'll address, let me bring up another case. There wasn't a case of a woman who burned herself and suffered, incredible burns to the body. But her case did not trigger these protests. It triggered another movement, a gender rights movement that is taking place online due to the pandemic. And so people are pushing for a law that would criminalize domestic violence. This woman, turns out, was suffering from abuse under her husband and her in-laws' hands. And so to escape all of this, she put herself on fire, and she survived it at first. She was in the hospital and her images circulated and people empathized and launched this online campaign pushing for a law that criminalizes domestic abuse. And so, this is not the actual protest movement, but I think it's connected in one way or another. So this one act of self-immolation did hit a nerve, especially among women and advocates of women's rights in Iraq.
Thanks a lot. Maybe Khulud, you could build upon that what Ruba just said in the Sudanese case, or maybe from the Sudanese perspective. What do you think? Does there need to be a wider context for these things to develop, or is like the local context is it always more important? So how interconnected are those developments, you think, and how does this change?
I think it's difficult to pose a counterfactual for so broad a region with such different histories and such different trajectories within them. But I think what is clear is that there is this kind of emotive coalescing around death, even in contexts where there has been a lot of violence, whether it's communal violence or state violence. I think when the level of helplessness that often triggers these deaths, it kind of hits upon the political grievances that people have. It kind of it makes them very acutely and very tangibly obvious. to people in a way that I think people forget. They kind of forget about these things in order to live their lives and deal with other grievances. I think they suppress, right? But these instances, whether it's Bouazizi or a few of deaths that have happened, for example, here in Sudan, that have triggered historically different protest movements, it is a kind of a rallying cry in a way. It's a very morbid one, but I think it highlights just how coercive the state is, right? And the problem, or rather the issue in a lot of these contexts, is that while they differ individually, the coercive state consolidation, I think, is a theme throughout all of these countries. And a lot of the Middle East came out of, obviously with major exceptions like Algeria, came out of colonialism, not necessarily fighting through. And so the governments that came up in the post-colonial setting started this process of state consolidation, and we're still seeing the remnants of we're still seeing this now, because a lot of these states haven't been consolidated. And sometimes what we see is a strong state infrastructure but a weak government. And I think the interplay between those two things is often what allows a lot of these grievances, etc., to fall through the cracks. But picking up on what Robo was saying, like Iraq is obviously a very different context to Sudan, and each one has its own history. For example, if Iraq has been in near constant state of protest for the past 15 years, Sudan looks very different, because our protest movements kind of are much more slow simmering, and then they kind of erupt. And we've had 3 such instances before. And I think, for when the view from Sudan, when Bouazizi self-immolated, it was very much, I think it allowed people to see, what they were going through, but it wasn't necessarily going to trigger anything in Sudan. What I think had become clear was that once these protest movements actually started to make waves and to push for social change, they were able to support each other in terms of solidarity. So I remember that in 2018, 2019, during the Sudanese revolution, the images coming from Algeria of mass mobilization really kind of helped people to stay the course in a way, because they saw that this was happening elsewhere in contexts that had a completely different history in some cases. Although Algeria also has a history of civil war. And so, I'm always hesitant to lump these areas together, because they come out of this convenient geography of the Middle East and North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that is partly because, as I said before, Sudan doesn't really fit in very neatly. And I think that's a good thing within either the Middle East and North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. It is very much this in-between liminal space. And I think that, if anything, should allow it to look into different trajectories of growth or political formation, rather than to put it into this pocket. I think what is interesting is that within the context, the regional context, republics have had a different kind of trajectory and in their uprisings than monarchies, and we've seen a much more suppressed monarchy. But within all of these contexts, we're seeing the military is a very key component. And we certainly feel that very acutely here in Sudan, because in many ways, this current revolution, what came arguably and very legitimately call it that, navigates this kind of coercive state consolidation.
Thanks, Khulud. Thanks also for bringing up again this concept of emotion that is a mobilizing force. So far, we have tackled this more like negative emotions or circumstances that come to a boil and force people to go to the streets. But there's also a lot of positive emotions, and we've seen that in all phases of the Arab Spring, also in the latest, especially within such protest environments where there's a lot of cheering, a lot of positive, constructive emotion. So, and how far would you, how far that an achievement is that, and also contrast to often this perception that only anger and despair bring people onto the streets. This goes to both of you. Ruba, if you may start.
I literally just finished writing a piece about emotion and the protest movement, and it hasn't come out yet. But emotions coming to the boiling point is not a bad thing. You know, collective emotion, mobilization. Well, collective emotion fuels mobilization, and it is a directive for policymakers and policy analysts. It is a directive for observers and commentators to listen to society, to know what society is going through, and as a result, know what to recommend for lawmakers, policymakers, etc. So in Iraq, there has been a mix of emotions. At a certain point in time, the emotion was fury, and this was most notably seen in Nasiriyah and Basra, where some protesters, I should not say all, a lot of people actually condemned this, but some protesters actually burned down the offices and headquarters of militias, as well as political parties, expressing their disapproval. No one has been harmed. They have never meant to, you know, harm anyone. They just want to make that statement. So they burned down, you know, empty headquarters and offices at night, knowing no one's there, especially of militias, of certain political parties. This has happened only in Basra and Nasiriyah. And again, you know, not all protesters agree with this method, but this has happened. And Nasiriyah in particular has been dubbed, you know, like for its fiery sentiment. And this was a manifestation of it. But emotion has mostly been expressed through joy, the joy mobilization, which I mentioned earlier. And October 25th, last week, you know, protests regathered to commemorate fallen protesters. And there was a lot of joy, you know, music is often played out loud, even in the most conservative cities like Najaf and Karbala in the south. People come together, especially in the early days of protests. It was like a festival. And even last week in places like Nasiriyah, you know, people put on music, there was face paint, there, you know, a lot of Iraqi flags, distribution of food, you know, even the poorest people of society would come forward, make sandwiches and hand them out to the protesters, worried that they're not getting enough food. In the colder days, they would, you know, send out blankets and warm drinks. So this has brought people together. Emotion is a good thing, you know, it's not irrational. I will keep on saying this. But another thing I want to touch on briefly, you know, Khulud was mentioning how each country is different. And I want to touch on social media. Iraq in particular was in isolationism up until 2003 under Saddam Hussein's regime. There was no internet up until 2003. So suddenly there has been this, you know, openness to the rest of the world that Iraqis, especially the older generation, never experienced. And social media has been very crucial since then for mobilization, for expression, for storytelling, especially in this protest movement. The Iraqi government imposed a 20-day internet shutdown last fall to silence the protests. And protesters in the Kurdish region, where that shutdown didn't apply, actually showed their solidarity with the rest of Iraqis, despite any sense of separatism. They expressed their solidarity and shared the word through their use of the internet. Iraqis have been very creative to mobilize with or without the internet. Some used computer games to communicate plans for the protest. So they'd go in and using either their names or anonymous ones and send messages about where they're going to meet. And so, you know, there has been a lot of creativity, and it is a different context from the rest of the Arab world. Like I said, you know, up until 2003, Iraqis were very isolated, and all of a sudden they're exposed to the world, to all possibilities, and they want more for themselves, just like everyone else does.
Khulud, how would you describe that for Sudan? Would seem it's not the same, kind of a similar experience that Sudan gets now so much exposure. Was also for decades under sanctions ban and kind of not really belonging anywhere. The spotlight was not really on there, and now so much is going on in such a short time. How does this change Sudanese society? Maybe to pose that question very generally, what do you observe how people change in the last years?
I think coming out of the kind of the sanctions in 2017, helped with connectivity. But Sudan had, at some point, even under Bashir, relatively good internet infrastructure. And what it also has is a very oral culture. So people are constantly calling each other on the phone, and any kind of application that supports that kind of oral culture is very much used and utilized. And I think this really did help people to be able to mobilize around the key issues, particularly just before the 2018. The internet can be shut off. That's the other thing. And the new government was formed. And even within that time, which was a very terrible time because a massacre had just occurred, and actually the internet was shut off in order to stop people from sharing details about the massacre, particularly internationally, because at that point the government was very, or I should say the military council that was in charge at the time was very aware of how it would look to have a massacre shortly after such a great peaceful revolution. And so what we saw then when the internet was shut off was that people still continue to find very analog ways of speaking to each other and coalescing around topics. And actually that period of time, which was I think only about 27 days, allowed people to organize for a 1 million person demonstration on the 30th of June, which was done almost entirely without the use of the internet. And even before the Bashir for bread and the queues for other utilities, they kind of formed a convening point for a lot of people to start airing their grievances and use that very, I hate the word traditional, but use this very kind of commonplace way of relating to each other, which is face to face, and being able to, air your grievances in public, political grievances specifically. And so I think that culture never really went away. I wouldn't like to see this digital culture completely take over, I think, because then we lose that ability to circumvent any kind of, digital crackdown, which I think this government or the military arm of this current government is acutely aware of. And we're seeing some legislation and some restriction come into play that will restrict how social media and the internet in general is used, particularly to get people to resist the military. And we're seeing actually that they're borrowing a lot of that from Egypt, because they, of course, too have a military government in control, and they are also clamping down. But I think we're seeing this clamping down throughout the post Arab Spring, if you will, happy moments. I remember when we spoke for the article, I was telling you that the feeling being when Bashir had just fell was such a joyous, indescribable moment. And I think that's the thing. There's so many people experience that, and that's what's keeping people going, despite the difficulties we have now. And we're seeing this in other contexts too. We have the cautionary tale of Libya and Syria and Yemen, which broke out into civil war, but people still want to chase that sense of joy, that sense of achievement, that sense of opportunity and hope and potential. And I think that's what's keeping people going. We'll probably see various iterations of this going forward.
Thanks, Khulud. That's that were very interesting thoughts about oral culture and the worth of non-internet dependent technology. And I think this is just one of many really interesting thoughts here. I would really like to explore them a lot more in depth. we certainly did that in that magazine that I'm happy to show you again. So if you are a German reader, I definitely can direct you to that magazine. If not, we're still happy to get many new acquaintances and get known, and we're happy for everyone who participated here in this Zoom event. And first and foremost, of course, our panelists. I think each of the topics we touched upon, we could basically host a conference, and I hope in better times. And I think we're still optimistic that we will see better times. I would be really happy to welcome you all to Berlin to some kind of conference where we could discuss the next step, the next hopefully improvements, progress. I think this is something that we're all looking forward to, especially us like Middle East watchers who are also kind of trapped and cut off from information in a way. It's so much important that we're in contact with people like you who give so much insight, and not only us, but also our audience. I would really like to thank you again for taking a time and for contributing to the magazine and the Zoom event. And we will certainly see us again, hopefully in person one time next year. Maybe one or two other Zoom events that we're going to host. I think this format gives us an opportunity to talk with you guys and also to have a really good insight for our readership, for our audience. And with that, I would like to thank you all for taking part in the Zoom event, and I wish you a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.